Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. I am Joel A. Erickson. I am joined, as always, by Nate Atkins. It is the end of a very long 2 days. The Colts have a 53-man roster. They have 3/4 of a practice squad-ish, at least that we know of at this point. We'll start here. Just overarching thoughts on the roster. We're gonna go position by position here and get into the weeds a little bit on every guy. But let's just start with your overall thoughts on the roster.
The decisions that came down, at the deadline, I think were none of them were too shocking once we found out that the NFLPA was striking down the emergency quarterback rule. So that opened up a spot for Sam Ehlinger. So kind of made sense based on the way things went that Evan Hull would give up a spot for him. I was a little surprised to see Chris Ballard cut 3 draft picks just because, he's cut them before, but that's just a lot in one class and 2 of them out of the secondary. And we'll get to that. It's the position that we cannot possibly stop talking about. But there are things with the secondary that I did find interesting, surprising, confusing, and scary. But overall, it's as far as what they've laid out of what they want this season to be and where they believe their team is, and especially Chris Ballard's tendencies. I memean, a lot of it lined up, especially, when we talk about the numbers at positions and when we get into the secondary, why I'm a little surprised by some of it is just it's not surprising for Chris Ballard, though, when he invests as much as he does in the defensive line. So keeping 10 guys there, and that's even with cutting a 7th round pick. It was a very Chris Ballard roster, and so it makes sense because he's the one deciding on it, and he's the one who picked the players, and here we are.
Yeah, this is less of an overarching thought and more in the weeds. I was unaware that Chris Ballard has had at least one rookie that he drafted fail to make the initial 53-man roster in every one of his 8 seasons as Colts GM. I was a little surprised.
Yeah.
I asked him about that today. He basically chalked it up to, if you're going to have a lot of draft picks, some of them aren't going to make the roster. So it's the other side of if you have a lot of draft picks, you give yourself more chances to hit. You also give yourself more chances to miss. And sometimes they miss. Sometimes it's okay if they lose a guy. They lost Jonah Laulu to the Las Vegas Raiders. But yeah. So I think the biggest thing is that for the most part, those cuts have come in the 5th, 6th, or 7th rounds. I think in most cases they feel pretty good about them, or not good about them, but they don't feel like they missed out. But here, we'll get into the roster now. I'm going to give you a choice here: heads or tails.
Let's go tails. Tails never fails.
Okay, so tails. We're going to start at what normally is the back of the roster and work our way up. And that means we're going to talk about special teams first, which normally they kept Matt Gay, Rigoberto Sanchez, and Luke Rhodes, which is not in itself remarkable, other than the fact that Matt Gay did not look great in the preseason, and the Colts don't seem to agree with everybody else on that.
Yeah, they barely gave him any work in the preseason, even though obviously there was no competition going on there. They seemed that confident in him, and Chris Ballard mentioned today that kind of hinted at something going on with Matt Gay late last season that played into why he struggled. But they see the guy that made all those field goals in Baltimore and set a record and won them that game, and is a Pro Bowler, and they paid more money than a free agent in history. So it sounds like Ballard was alluding to some kind of health situation. He did miss a day late last season, so that's always what you wonder, if a player's dealing with something more than what we know. That's what he implied. Something else was going on there, but I would have liked a little bit more clarity on that, because he also did say that was just a last season thing. So the misses this preseason, maybe they do just chalk it up to mostly one game with a new holder, and that it wasn't at all his fault. But yeah, they're very confident in him. So if that's the case, then obviously this was a very straightforward type of decision here for these special team spots. Obviously, Rioberto bounced back and had a career year after his Achilles tear, and Luke Rhodes, they just extended last year. So they've extended all three of these guys, and they've kind of made it so that the kicking punting game, it theoretically should be a strength of this team, the way that they built it. So we will see. They need Matt Gay to be Matt Gay, though, because that is one of the only free agent investments they've made for 2 years. And so that would be a real problem if that became an issue for them. But they don't seem like they think that's really at risk at all.
Yeah, there's also guaranteed money still on the contract, I think through the end of this year. So that's obviously playing a role in why they don't have a quick trigger as well. I mean, they've Ballard defended him pretty vehemently today, but I think it would be probably naive to think that there's nothing going on there with the guaranteed money that he's got on his contract. I don't really have a ton to add to that. We'll just move on. The thing about going back to front is that means we're right into the secondary with the safeties. One fairly large surprise here. I think most people had Ronnie Harrison on most of their roster projections. Someone said to me last week that they thought that there was maybe a possibility that he wasn't one of the guys on there. Turned out the veteran got cut fairly early in the process. He was a first-day cut. Football doesn't always work that way, where it's like the players who have the longest chance to make the roster end up as first-day cuts. I think sometimes they do that to give veterans theoretically more runway on the market before everybody else gets released. But the more I thought about it, the more it makes sense. If Julian Blackmon is playing strong safety, which is, I think, what I think is going to happen. I think Julian Blackmon is going to play strong safety, and Nick Cross is going to play free. If that's the case, then he's going to be on the field 100% of the snaps, unless he's hurt.
Yep.
And that doesn't leave much of a defensive role for Ronnie Harrison because Jalen Carlisle, I stepped on linebackers, my bad. He's moved into his role in the linebacker room. And he didn't really play special teams a ton during training camp. That's kind of my thought process on that. I think the counter would be, and you could probably make this case, that what happens if Julian Blackmon gets hurt?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a small safety room. It's 4 guys, but 3 guys who've played, defense in this league. Rodney Thomas is the one backup I think the one backup in the secondary you can feel reasonable about, just based on the fact that he's started in this league. I think he's backup caliber. He's no longer a guy they want to look at as a starting option, but when you play the amount that he has, and he's got still pretty good tackling and knows the defense well, like you feel like he can step in as a free safety, but he's only a free safety. So what's interesting is it sort of sets, if Blackman's going to start at strong safety, I think that's more what he'll play. Then Nick Cross is the backup at strong safety. And so if there's a Blackmon injury, Nick Cross then steps into the biggest leadership role they have outside of Mike. And he has Rodney Thomas back there. And then they're kind of out of backups. So it's still a thin spot. But yeah, it really helps that Julian, as versatile as he is, being able to play both of those. And it makes more sense for them to play Blackmon at strong safety with just what Gus Bradley has laid out that he wants in that strong safety. He always wants a veteran. He's only really trusted Blackmon and Rodney McLeod to do it. But it is really going to teach us very quickly where Nick Cross is, because playing single high free safety, I mean, you are not hidden at all. Not with the rest of the makeup of the secondary, even if the pass rush is really good. So that was kind of one of the interesting points from Ballard, was asked, you can hear from him about Nick Cross's progress, and he had very nice things to say about, I thought he had a great preseason and the practices were pretty good. But you kind of again felt this weird spot they're in with Nick Cross, where a lot of the talk was still about how they rushed him out there when he was too young. They overhyped him. They handed him a job. And that same hesitancy feels like it's still there. Because, again, Ballard wouldn't say that he's a starter. They have not named that. That's maybe some of that's gamesmanship. But I also sense they feel kind of burned by how that went the first time around. But at the same time, they kind of, based on their roster decisions and what else they've told other players, they did kind of just hand him the starting job. I mean, they decided kind of late last season that Rodney Thomas wasn't a starter, and they released Ronnie Harrison, who was the one other option to be someone who could have pushed for a role at safety other than Julian Blackmon. So we'll see how it goes. It's going to be the ultimate bet of their season, I think, is obviously at large what they're doing in the secondary, but there's no bigger bet on a player they're making to answer something without having proven it like Nick Cross. So we're going to be talking about that all season. And I think we're going to, whether or not this team hits its floor or its ceiling, I think we're going to be able to tie back to how much he's able to deliver on that promise.
Yeah. To me, it all falls on Cross now. And, Ballard was very effusive in his praise of him, saying that some of the issues he's had earlier in his career is just his youth. But they really need Nick Cross to establish him as a starting safety, establish himself as a starting safety. Rodney Thomas has the experience, and like you, I don't think that it's going to be like necessarily disastrous. But he does also, even in camp, he was still struggling with the issue of just being a little bit late in his reactions. And that's a problem. They need someone to drive on the ball hard. It comes down to Nick Cross. Nick Cross has to be good. And if Julian Blackmon gets hurt, it's not great. I think it's probably Cross at strong and Thomas at free. Although, and I haven't looked today, it's hard to keep track when you're in the weeds of what the Colts are doing. It's hard to know what's going on in the rest of the league. But to my knowledge, I think a bunch of fairly veteran safeties got cut yesterday. I know Adrian Amos got cut. I think there's a couple other ones. So there's probably going to be a stopgap on the open market. It'd be nothing more than a stopgap to help out with that. But we've seen Colts teams in those positions do okay before. People forget Andrew Sendejo played like a half a season as a starter here. That brings us to corner. Corner is maybe one of the most interesting ones. There's more intrigue here. This is where I went wrong on my roster projections. I went 50 of 53. One of them was the NFLPA's fault. The other two was that I gave them corners instead of a defensive tackle and a defensive lineman. I had them keeping a lot of corners. They actually didn't keep that many. They kept the four who played with the first team, which is Juju Brents, Jalen Jones, Kenny Moore. Those are your starters. And then Dallas Flowers is a fourth corner. Darrell Breaker was on the roster for a little bit and then off of it. And then they brought Jalen Simpson and Amir Speed back to the practice squad. And I think Speed will probably factor in special teams. This is where they cut their draft picks. Jalen Simpson, Mike Abraham, those were the two additions they've made here. Abraham, to my knowledge, I'm trying to keep track of it right now. I don't think he's signed anywhere on the practice squad, which is kind of wild for a draft pick who had a fumble 6 in the preseason. Don't have any insight in that. Just kind of weird. This corner spot, like the safeties have gotten most of it, but we've been talking about this. Corner just feels like you're really hoping for a lot to go right. There's a lot of if at corner. Ballard keeps saying over and over again, these are young guys, they'll get better. I think they're a lot better than last year, but man, there's a lot of projection in this cornerback room.
Yeah, they have 5 total cornerbacks, and only 3 of them can play on the outside. And of those 5 cornerbacks, you just go through it here. Juju Brents, at outside corner, missed half the season last year. And since he was drafted, has dealt with a wrist injury, 2 different hamstring injuries, a severe quad injury, an ankle injury that led to its surgery, and now a nose injury. So, that is, you always say, even if you had corners who are like really established, who are really high level and who are durable, if none of these concerns were there, they always say you still need corners that you really trust on the outside. And ideally, you have more in case of an injury. They only have 3 total who can play on the outside, other than Kenny Moore can play on the outside when they're in base. But it's just a hard way to live very often in this league. We got to that spot last year where that's when they moved Tony Brown out there. They didn't want to move Kenny Moore, and so it's interesting. I mean, Kenny Moore has, I would call his career, mostly durable, but he's had 2 different seasons where he's missed at least 5 games. There's injuries that can always threaten him as he just turned 29 years old. And then Jalen Jones is your other spot where so far as far as the NFL goes has not he played all 17 games last year. He doesn't have some injury history, but you are dealing with, you're taking the bet that he's an every game starter, and there's no doubt about it, which that's a risk too in the secondary. I mean, just a year ago, at this time coming into the year, it's a little slightly different position, but same secondary as that's what people were saying about Rodney Thomas, who was the 7th round pick, who had a nice rookie year and played every game and led them in picks. And they were benching him by halfway through, and now he's a backup. So they are taking some real gambles here. And you look across this entire secondary at the backups at each position. In the nickel, their backup is Womack.
Samuel Womack. We haven't talked much about the new guy yet. We can do that in a second.
Yeah. Samuel Womack, who's we'll get into him, but he's played 216 career snaps. That's your backup at each outside corner spot. There's only one guy who can play either spot in nickel, which is Dallas Flowers, who's coming off the Achilles tear. That's where the most surprising or puzzling thing to me was them cutting Daryl Baker Jr. I know he's on its surface, that doesn't seem like a player that you can't possibly let go. I mean, he's an undrafted guy who isn't a starter anymore, but I thought he was their 3rd best outside corner, behind Juju Brents, Jalen Jones, because of the long way back Dallas Flowers needs from an Achilles tear for a player who's built on athleticism. I thought Daryl Baker showed better coverage when he was in the Bengals practices and the Cardinals practices, or not the Bengals practice, the Bengals preseason game. I thought he showed a little bit. Cardinals practices were better. He's had some other moments where he's been up and down, but that is a guy who had some experience there. If they have 2 injuries at those spots, they're going to play somebody at an outside corner spot who's basically never played it before. The last time I remember them doing that was Tony Brown. So I'm just very surprised not surprised necessarily, but puzzled that you would keep a defensive tackle like Taven Bryan on this roster who has no role to play. And we've seen what happens when he does play, versus a corner like Daryl Baker, who I think is your 3rd best outside corner, at least as a guy that you've seen fits that position. You're not moving him from a different position. And also a guy who played a little bit of special teams. So the way that whole thing went down was odd to me. I get why they went after Womack, because they did not have a backup nickel. It was going to be, after they cut Chris Lamons and Mike Abraham, it was going to have to be Julian Blackmon or Nick Cross, I think, which obviously is a problem when they have other spots they have to start at. So they had to do something there, but I don't know. I thought they'd either go for a guy who could play inside and outside, or one of those defensive tackles, the player to cut in order to get yourself a backup nickel. It just feels beyond how good the secondary can be on a starter. This is one of the.
Yeah, the weird thing is now they have 3 nickels, and because they brought Chris Lamons back on the practice squad. It almost leaves Micah Abraham out. That's pretty weird for a draft pick. I'm very curious to see where that happens. It's like one of those low-key things. Who knows? But kind of weird. Womack, yeah, like you said, he's kind of a defensive player, kind of a special teamer. We'll see if he has to play. Moving on to the linebackers. This one, there really wasn't much of a surprise to the linebackers. It's Zaire Franklin and EJ Speed are the starters. Jalen Carlisle, the rookie, is the third linebacker. Shagua Lobi backs up Franklin in the event that Franklin gets hurt because the other two don't play the middle. And then Grant Stewart's a special teamer. I didn't have a whole lot else there. Just kind of what we expected.
Yeah, I mean, this is the position that you could just kind of trust the Colts with on all levels, the way they draft them, the way they find them, the way they coach and develop them. It's Gus Bradley's natural position. Richard Smith's been doing this forever, and Chris Ballard can scout him in his sleep. So, yeah, they were just able to roll back Zaire Franklin and EJ Speed to be their two guys who play all the time, and they're taking a bet on Jalen Carlisle. That is a little interesting. That was why they moved Ronnie Harrison off of linebacker to strong safety, and then he kind of was out of a job after that. So there's a bit of a bet there, but only a bit of one because when they play in, they're going to be a nickel mostly, and so it'll be those two linebackers, and you'll just kind of ride them. And obviously, if there's an injury, then it becomes a different thing. But at least Shaguna Lobi's played there, so that was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, if there's a practice squad guy to watch, maybe keep an eye out for Liam Anderson. They must really like Anderson because he was out for a little bit, for a couple of weeks with an injury. They put him back in. He played right away, and then they kept him. So that might be a guy to watch if there's an injury and they make a pull-up. But not much to say there. Defensive tackle. There is some stuff to say here. This was – you tried to bait me into it, but I was disciplined. I didn't get to Taven Bryan until it was an appropriate time. What is it that you would say Taven Bryan is supposed to do here on this roster?
Take practice reps from Raekwon Davis until he's conditioned. That's all
I just
got.
don't see how you play him in a game.
No.
Like we're starting at the bottom of it, but like Adetomiwa Adebawore took a big step forward as a pass rusher, which is initially what they said they were bringing Taven Bryan in. He's a better pass rusher now, based on what we saw in training camp, than Bryan is. DeForest Buckner plays that position anyway. He's still going to play 65 to 70% of the snaps. You have Dayo Odengbo who can rush in there. Tyquan Lewis can rush in there. And then at nose, which Taven Bryan can't play anyway, we know that from last year, because he's terrible against the run. There's no other way to say it. You have Grover Stewart and Raekwon Davis who started for Miami last year. I just – why?
Again, I have no idea why you would keep that over a guy who – Darrell Baker at worst, maybe they clearly see Dallas Flowers is better than Darrell Baker, but at worst, he's your number 4 outside corner at a spot with like volatile, unproven young players who have some injury concerns, and they're keeping guys who I don't see how you could ever play. Not that you could never play Taven Bryan as like a 3 technique, but they're not going to for the reasons you laid out. It's one of those, I don't know. They have not wanted to play Dayo Odengbo really at all. This preseason has been an interesting thing. So I don't know if that factored at all into it. I'd hope not, because Dayo.
My goodness, would I be against that?
Had 8.5 sacks last year. We look up Taven Bryan's career. He's got 10.5 sacks in his career, and he was drafted in 2018. That was the last year that the Colts won a playoff game, to let you know when that was. So, yeah, I don't know if that. But the thing is, even if that was somehow the logic, then they should be doing something. They should be trading Dayo if that's going to be the case. And I'm not saying they should. I think Dayo. I've been the one who profiled Dayo in a been high on what he can do as an inside rusher. It's just been peculiar. They haven't wanted to use it. But it's like, that's the thing. They're keeping guys around that either they're not wanting to play or have proven that they are not super capable. And also they don't seem to need them. It is just the only way you can explain it is Chris Ballard. He wants to have 9 or 10 defensive linemen. That's just how he wants to build a team. And he's going to find enough to put on the roster, even if it means being really light somewhere else. That's kind of where they're at.
If they don't want to play Dio Odengbo, I have some serious concerns about the staff.
Yeah, I agree.
He had 8 sacks, was very high in pressures last year, high in quarterback hits. If they're really not going to play him, there's just no reason for that. He didn't switch systems. Like the Seahawks traded Darrell Taylor to the Bears last week, even though Taylor's been fairly productive as a pass rusher in his first 3 seasons in Seattle. They changed systems. Like if they're not playing Dio, like there's going to be some serious questions why you keep somebody that talented on the bench. Other than that,
do you have any other ideas of why they're doing this? Because I'm making the best guess.
I'm just chalking it up to Chris Ballard's obsession with having as many large humans around as possible.
Yeah.
At least I should say I'm hoping that's what it is, because it would be really dumb if they're not going to play a Dio.
It just I get the philosophy to a level. Obviously, this is a position that is highly rotational more than any other on the outside of maybe running back, any other on defense. He's always had that obsession with having a lot of different pass rushers. Again, I get that on a philosophical level. But to take it to the extreme of this is like, at some point, it doesn't matter at all how good your 5th string 3 technique is if you can't cover Tank Dell and Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs. And that's a risk if you have even one injury. Like, I'm not even saying that the guys they have at corner are not going to cut it. I don't know. They might. We haven't seen enough out of Juju Brents to know for sure. And Jalen Jones, is a young player. Maybe he gets better. He could take a step forward. He could take a step back. I don't know. But what I do know is they don't have very many bodies there. They have 3 guys who can play outside corner and nickel. And I just don't – I've never covered a team like that. So I'm just very interested to see how that plays out.
Yep. Two of the defensive tackles they cut, Eric Johnson and Jonah Lalu, were claimed by the Patriots and Raiders respectively. Don't have many thoughts on that. Just kind of underscores that they had depth at that position. Could have traded Taven Bryan. That's my last thing. Maybe that's my last thing. We'll see. He might come back up later. Defensive end. Defensive end is another position. I do not have a ton of thoughts on the moves they made. It went the way it should have based on what I saw in training camp. Isaiah Land has taken a little bit of a step forward. I don't know how much he's going to play, but he can definitely play like the Jacob Martin role from last year. 200-ish snaps, when guys are hurt, that kind of thing. They really like Tyquan Lewis. They should. He looks very quick. And then you have Kwity Paye, slim down. You have Dio, we just talked about. And you have Latu. And I think one of the fascinating things this season for me is going to be watching Latu play his rookie year out and see if what we saw on the practice field with how he moves, his instincts. Did you see the rush he had in a preseason game? One of our listeners sent this one to me. Here's a clip where they tried to send a chip to his outside and had a tackle on the inside, and he did a swim move while that was going on, and they kind of both didn't touch him. Yeah.
That was
like
funny.
That. It's just like a different kind of instinct level that he's got. So I'm gonna be honest. As much as we're talking about the secondary, I'm gonna have a hard time when 97's on the field not training my binoculars on him. That's all I really have to say about defensive ends, though. That part mostly made sense to me. Jannard Avery's back as insurance. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just interesting to at least ask Chris Ballard about designating Samson Ebukam as a return player from injured reserve. And he said what made sense, but it's just good confirmation that it's a complete long shot for that to happen. He said they just didn't really have anybody that felt at all like they had a shot to do that. So, why not look at their most important position on defense? And, and who knows? They probably would have to have a really long playoff run for that to even be something they could toy with, because as we're talking about, at athletic positions like Dallas Flyers is dealing with this at cornerback, it takes more than a year. It takes a year to be able to play. It takes more than that to be able to feel explosive again. And sometimes it's like a 2-year injury in that way. So to come back in like 3 months, yeah, it'd be crazy. But it really underscores where they're at with Jelani Woods, which I know we'll get to with the tight ends. But like, I had asked, like, was that at all a consideration? They basically said no, not at all. Is what Chris Ballard said. So yeah, I mean, but Samson Ebicon going down in the way Latu's hit the ground running, we just have clarity there. And Chris Ballard said like he's going to play. So like Latu's going to start opposite Kwity Paye. And then you got that rotation behind them. And the only question I have, again, same thing, defensive tackle, because Dio is both. Do they play Dio? How much? What's his role? Because it's been that's the one role, the only role really that's on the mixing a defensive end that's hard to forecast at this point. But everything else is kind of pretty straightforward.
That brings us to the offensive line. We have finally made to the offensive side of the ball, the one that everyone wants to talk about. But we're starting with the position that's least sexy, and you can't draft in fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a position where I don't have a lot of notes because it's pretty straightforward. I mean, they have their healthy 5 out there, which is a great sign for them. Very interesting to have, third straight year where they have the same 5. They put these guys in the middle of 2022. We know what led them to that utter disaster, but they played better in the second half. Chris Ballard took the bet on them, got a new offensive line coach in Tony Sperano Jr., and they completely turned around last year. And I think you have to feel pretty darn good about that group on a performance level heading into this season when they've played that much together, when you've got high-level players at least high level players, at least 3 spots, and you could argue 4, and who knows, maybe even a 5 if Will Fries, he really looks like a good pass protector out there if he could make a little bit of stride in the run game. The depth is the only thing I think really you could talk about here. Is I thought maybe they would go after a tackle on waivers just because Blake Freeland has struggled a lot. They like the reps that Matt Gonsalves has put out there, but he's a rookie and it's he's cross training, and so that's another spot of depth, the swing tackle spot that I treat a little bit like outside cornerback, is that the player they're betting on there had a troubling preseason. It's a big bet on a player who's unproven and did not have a great camp, and they're backing up a starter who, while there's a lot to like about his game, there's injury concerns with Braden Smith. We kind of went through that all year last year, and then it's kind of, I think that's an underrated, but it snuck up on me, kind of Braden's injury issues going back to 2020 now, where it even feels like when he's out there, he's still playing through something. So it just seems to be something to keep in the back of your mind as he's getting into his late 20s and a lot of games and miles at. So I feel great about this group, but the depth is a bit of a wild card at most because it's really young.
Yeah, I think, one of the things in my projection, I didn't have Danny Pinter on it, but I was thinking about it, and if Tanner Bordellini's toe maybe is going to linger a couple weeks into the regular season, you definitely want to have the center. Will Fries can play that. Dalton Tucker maybe can play that, but they didn't do it during training camp. Those other guys did. So I think that's part of the reason that, like, for me, Pinter makes more sense than Taven Bryan. There it is. He came back. Didn't take that long. Didn't take that long at all. And then the other thing that was interesting was today, Chris Ballard. Chris Ballard himself called swing tackle a big deal right at the beginning of camp, and I think Matt Gonzalez is the swing tackle. I think he said so. Because he said they feel like Matt can play both right and left side. They said that Blake has mostly played on the right, and when he switches over to the left side, he's had more trouble. Right?
Yeah.
So that to me says Matt Gonzalez is your swing tackle. Freeland is more of a right tackle. And then I mean the front line five guys, those guys, based on what they did last year, it'd be a surprise if they weren't pretty good. So That's the offensive line. Not a lot to discuss there. Tight end. The real intrigue at tight end was what happened with Jelani Woods. Jelani Woods placed on season-ending injured reserve. Mild surprise. There had been some talk that he could come back. He had surgery on turf toe, which, again, turf toe, the worst form of turf toe is a dislocation of a joint in your foot. So, again, they've just named turf toe terribly. It makes it sound so sounds like something Tough Acton Tinactin could take care of, but it's much worse than that. Anyway, he had surgery. There was some talk, and my understanding is that his camp felt like he could come back this year. The Colts did not feel like that. In fact, Chris Ballard answered your question about that with a flat no today. And so Woods is really the interesting part from just a long-term standpoint because he's really behind the 8 ball now as far as getting his career going in Indianapolis. Beyond Woods, though, since we've talked so much about Woods, with Woods not in the fold, what they've got going on, it really is an interesting group just because they're going to have to play roles.
Yeah, they're very defined role players because these are 4 players they kept at tight end who they have their one trick. So you've got Mo Alley-Cox and Drew Ogletree are blockers, and you've got Kylan Granson and Will Mallory are the receivers. There's a little bit of variation within that where they started to talk about Will Mallory maybe being a little bit more of a down the field guy. Kylan Granson has mostly had sort of a short, the intermediate. It's kind of his game, either trying to win on short, shallow crossers or settling into zones. He's probably the best at trying to do that. But it feels like last year again where they're going to mix and match, and they did that last year enough to get more than 800 total yards out of this position. So for a team that's going to run the ball a ton, keeping 2 blocking tight ends was a decent tell about those plans, I thought. But yeah, this is going to be the position now that that Jelani Woods, his season's done, and it has the feeling that they're kind of ready to. There at least isn't the trust that there's much there. This is going to be the position that you're going to hear talked about all the time with the draft going into next year as the primary need of the offense, at least if things go according to plan at these other spots. And so to me, it's more about they need the backfield to be electric, like it looks like it can be. They need the receivers to make plays like they have in camp and like they look capable of. And if those things happen, it'll be totally fine that these guys are role players. I think the only times we'll be talking a lot about them and putting anything on them, any kind of real pressure, will be if one of those things disappoints or they have injuries that all of a sudden zap some of the upside at those other skill spots. But to me, the skill spots outside of tight end they're so much better than this team has ever had since I got here. And tight end has kind of stayed the same way. They've just not ever really solved that with one guy, and they're kind of mixing and matching. And so I expect another year of that from that group.
Will Mallory now kind of feels to me like the player with maybe the upside possibility that we don't know about. Just he didn't play very many snaps last year, caught 18 passes. I don't think he's the same type of field stretcher, but that Woods could maybe be. But you don't have to be that guy. Yeah, 159 snaps last year for 18 catches. The thing is, though, you don't necessarily have to be that guy to be a successful tight end one option if you can develop. So Mallory becomes the intriguing player for me. He's also had his own issues with staying healthy, so I got to put that caveat in there. But him as a receiving tight end, he's kind of got the upside, whereas everybody else I kind of feel like we know. know what they are. I'm thinking like for Mallory, I'm thinking more of like I'm trying to think of somebody who just catches a lot of passes, but isn't known as like the super like fast guy, like a Hunter Henry-ish. One of those types. I mean, like the ultimate comparison here. I don't like saying this. I was trying to find somebody less than this because you don't want to do this. But like the ultimate comparison is Jason Witten. Jason Witten was not like a run downfield for 60 yards. He wasn't a Jimmy Graham. He was just a catch guy. It's more, but
maybe like Jake Ferguson, the Cowboys.
Yeah, there you go. And moves on to wide receiver, which wide receiver I think is less interesting for who they kept because the top 6 was pretty obvious the entire training camp. Real quick, I don't know why I still have to keep saying this. Ashton Doolin is more than people think he is.
Yes.
He's been on the first team, and I know people should know this because I wrote it. He's been on the first team in like their goal line packages and heavy run packages with Alec Pierce. I presume because of the blocking ability. So there's a role. He's a gunner. There's a role. Like he's just more than what people think he is. People think of him as this like afterthought type player. He's a little more than that. And he gives you such versatility from a roster spot. That's not surprising. Josh Downs, we don't really know. What did Ballard say about Josh Downs today?
He just said they have to see. They're hopeful that he could be back week 1. He's the only one that they've given timelines to other guys, and so they're, so you read between that. It seems like we just have to get to week 1, which I mean just next week, and see does he have a chance. But it doesn't sound like it would be much longer than week 1. So I think it's kind of that's the over under is like, does he play that game or does he miss that game against the Texans?
Yeah. So Downs and Pittman, until further notice, I kind of feel like I know what they are. They said Alec Pierce. This is interesting. Alec Pierce. Chris Ballard said he had a really strong camp, his best camp yet, and he said as strong a camp as anybody. Which that's very interesting. That's a very interesting. I also thought Alec Pierce had a strong camp, but I'm the outlier in the Alec Pierce evaluation process, so I always try to temper that a little bit. And Ballard seemed like he liked it a lot. A.D. Mitchell, his answer on him kind of highlighted the boomer bust for me. Didn't he say something about like he's super talented? We've got to get him up to speed, kind of.
Yep, talented young player. He's still learning. Yeah, so that kind of shows you they drafted a guy on tools and they have to get him there over time. So that's kind of the thing is that when you combine that answer, he's kind of telling you that like they love A.D. Mitchell's talent, but Alec Pierce is the one that's going out there and doing it every day. And so I think that is telling when we get to a spot where they are sharing one position, and that's a position where they're going to use, I just really think they're going to use both because they're proven to be a little bit different in that, like what they love about A.D. Mitchell, what drew them to him in the first place was his ability to separate at the top of routes and kind of live in the middle of the field. We know Alec Pierce's game so far has been the speed down the field, that field stretching type role, which they're not going to get out of. That's not Michael Pittman's role. So that's a little bit like tight end, just those two players in the sense that they have defined roles, at least to start. And then they'll see, does A.D. Mitchell, does he catch on? Fast enough? Does he grow within a season? It's a long year. But I will say that, like, obviously to start, A.D. Mitchell is going to play in the slot if Josh Downs has to miss. I think that is good in the sense, like, that's way better depth than they've had in the past, even dating back to last year by far. So that is good. I will also say, though, that I think that Josh Downs' absence has played a role in why people have not loved what they've seen out of the Colts passing game the past couple weeks. I think that is, if you think about it, Josh Downs is having one of the best camps of anybody when he got hurt. And so you knew they were going to obviously lose something when they lost him. But I think it got glossed over when, you move A.D. Mitchell into the slot, and it felt like on a talent level, you're just kind of shuffling guys around and no big deal. But what Josh Downs gives this passing game is like he keeps them on schedule and he gives them a floor, a sort of baseline to operate through, which they have some of that in Michael Pittman, but that's the only guy you can say that about. That's where we start talking about those tight ends are not like, there's not a go-to guy. There's not timing built. You think about Anthony Richardson, like the thing that got people alarmed in the week in Cincinnati, both the preseason game and the joint practice, was mostly sort of a timing chemistry situation. That's where, Geno Stone called him out about, he's not seeing his receivers. He's throwing to spots. And we saw, a couple misses in that preseason game. And I think it's caused people to, happens with young quarterbacks, lose their minds a little bit. I just think that's the Josh Downs effect in some way, is that he has barely thrown to guys like Alec Pierce, A.D. Mitchell, Kylan Granson, Will Mallory. It's not only that he didn't play a lot last year, it's that while he played, those guys were the interchangeable pieces, or in Mitchell's case, he wasn't here. Pittman's the only one out of all the guys they have out there who's just returning to the role that he had last year in a way that Anthony got to throw to very much, an actual volume role. Josh Downs was the different thing because he was always, started 17 games at slot receiver. Obviously, Anthony only played 4 of those, but they came in the same draft class. They were throwing in the parking lot as soon as like the night before rookie minicamp. And then Josh Downs hits the ground running in rookie minicamp. And then you see that looked like a real connection when Josh Downs was out there this summer. So I think that's the effect they're feeling, is just not having that rhythm player for Anthony Richardson, who is going to be a quarterback who has ups and downs even with Josh Downs. I think those have become more glaring or noticeable without that sort of baseline, where it does become more of like he's trying to make this work right now with guys he hasn't played much with. So that's where they may have a good talent answer to that with A.D. Mitchell, but he is not nearly as, on the same page with Anthony Richardson as a slot receiver running a variety of routes from that position as Josh Downs was. And so that's where I think we're learning even more the value of Josh Downs when he hasn't been out there as much as when he was out there.
Running backs. I'll just put this question simply. We all know what Jonathan Taylor can be. How do you feel about the depth?
A little concerned. I do think they do like Trey Sermon a lot, and it really is nice to see him back out there practicing this week, and then has the next week to build up into week 1. It's sort of a hodgepodge group of just the two behind him, where he's like the runner and Tyler Goodson has more the third down role, though I think he had a nice preseason. So I think those two guys, Sermon and Goodson, it's fair. Like, they are probably a little slept on outside of here. I think they're a little better than maybe like they just are unproven guys, but I do think there's a little something to both of them. But there's a big difference between, can those guys take a series from Jonathan Taylor, or can Tyler Goodson step in on third down on an obvious passing situation? Can they be complements, or can they be the guys for this run game if Jonathan Taylor goes down? So I think they're good additional pieces to have in this backfield where you have a bell cow superstar back like Taylor. But I think I'm still fairly concerned if Taylor goes down for an extended stretch of, Taylor wants to run the ball to this level. It's going to be growing this much in the passing game with a young quarterback, just how much they want to run with these guys, and if either one's built to do it at that level of volume. Again, though, it's another area where like Josh Downs to me is key to that. It's like an extension of the run game. Is the reason I've comped into Golden Tate and his role in this offense is when Jim Bob Cooter was in Detroit when we were there, they couldn't run the ball at all, but they used Golden Tate out of the slot as like their version of a run game where they get 4 yards here and there on a high volume level to basically create the effect of running the ball without actually handing it off. So if Josh Downs is out there, I think there's ways. Shane Steichen's so talented and good at adjusting when he doesn't have something, but it would be the issue is like if Downs isn't out there and Taylor's not out there, I think you lose a lot of that supporting run game element that's not Anthony Richardson. And that's where you get scared, because the whole thing that we've been able to avoid this training camp, but is going to be a conversation thing to watch, is still the durability and the health of Anthony Richardson. And so they've got to set him up in a position where he is not having to carry this run game as much as influence the pieces and dictate the matchups that everybody else is going to have, while occasionally sprinkling in the scramble and the design run in the right moment and all of that. So, it's what I feel of this backfield. It entirely depends on how much Jonathan Taylor stays healthy. So far, he's fully healthy. That's great. But also, he's a running back. He's missed games to injury 2 straight years. There's 17 games. They want to run him a lot. So I still have a few concerns about this in the long run.
They're really testing sort of the theory of the replaceable running back, is what I keep thinking. Like, you have the high-paid running back that some people weren't sure if you should pay because he's a running back. And then behind him, you have 2 guys who are cast-offs from other teams. So it's like a real polar opposite in terms of investment. And you didn't have to do that last year with Zach Moss around. But you have to do it now. Or you don't have to do it now. Have to do it now is the wrong way to say that. They could still add somebody with a little bit more juice, a little bit more. I'm going to say this real quick while we're talking about this. I don't really want them to do – I don't think it's a good idea to do a move like the Cowboys just did, where you bring in Dalvin Cook, who last year couldn't stick on 2 teams and is old. I think if you're looking for you got to be looking for somebody with juice, somebody that maybe got squeezed out by, a numbers game somewhere, somebody who looked good in the preseason. I'd rather have that than I'd have like an older guy whose best days is an explosive backer behind him. But yeah, there's so little investment behind Taylor, and there's so much investment in Taylor that like I said, they're kind of stressing the paradigm on both ends.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to put it. Because Ballard kind of said that too. He said, I think Jonathan Taylor is a superstar. They loved Zach Moss last year, and they wanted to have him back. Didn't get him back, didn't replace him. So it's like I think they're seeing this backfield the same way. As you probably could tell in this podcast, there's certain positions that I do not see the same way as the Colts when they evaluate their own roster. But this one I think we do, which is superstar running back, pieces behind him that I think are good complements, but they're not the Zach Moss step up and do it. So it all comes down to like it's only fair to expect Taylor to miss some games. Playing 17 games is so hard as a running back, especially the one that they want to run as much as he is. It just makes sense that he's not going to play 17. But there's a big difference between him playing 15 versus 10 versus 8. Like they can get by for a game or two. Like they had a great game last year against a pretty solid Steelers defense where they ran basically every play of the fourth quarter with Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson. So like for a game in a vacuum, they can do it. But doing that over the course of several games, the thing that I'm going to look for is when Taylor's not out there and one of these backs is, like, our defense is going to force Anthony Richardson to hand the ball off because they don't have that fear of these guys versus a quarterback who can run 4.4 and is 244 pounds, or Jim Irsay says he's 260 pounds, somewhere in there. Like that's the guy who can take it to the house and kill you. I think we just haven't seen Anthony with a back like this very often. He got to play with Zach Moss, and I think that did happen though. He did influence the defense, and Zach Moss killed him. Can these guys do it at the same level, or and if they can't, then defenses are just going to make them hand off. That's just kind of the interesting thing to watch. So yeah, it's going to test these guys. It's like, are they ready for that challenge? Because this offensive line and Anthony Richardson are going to set them up with easier jobs than a lot of other places, but they want to do it at a high enough volume and still be explosive doing it. Can they replicate any of the explosiveness without Taylor? That's what I'm curious to watch.
Nate has done a good job already kind of previewing this from the Anthony Richardson side. We're on to the quarterbacks. We'll start with Richardson. Wait, who do you want to start with? You want to start with Anthony Richardson or Jason Bean?
I'll start with the starting quarterback. Seems like he's going to be the more talked about guy going forward. It's like we're actually in preseason where, look, Jason Bean had a great preseason. Sam Ehlinger in the past has. Those guys, it's exciting for Sam to make another roster, and Jason Bean's back. But it's what's interesting to me about the preseason is it's like that is such a preseason storyline to talk about number 3 quarterbacks. I'm not saying that there's times when like the 49ers have had to rely on that to have a chance to win. But the way this team is constructed, the way what this season is about, that is something you hope we don't talk about again, is the number 3 quarterback. Possibly talk about the number 2, because the same way I talk about Jonathan Taylor, it's just Anthony's play style, his history does not suggest 17 games is likely. I don't say that to scare anybody. That's just life as a running quarterback. Guys miss games. Jalen Hurts misses a couple games here or there. Lamar Jackson misses a couple games here and there. We probably will talk about Joe Flacco. I bet Joe Flacco makes a start this year. You hope it's not that many, but he will be a talking point. If we get to a point where we're talking a lot about quarterbacks beyond those 2, something went kind of wrong this season. And the last time they were in that spot was 2022.
Wait. I'm going to throw a scenario out at you. Anthony Gould suffers a sprained ankle. Not bad. It's just like a 2-week injury. Dallas Flowers, been okay on the kick return. Doesn't quite look the same on the dynamic kick return. You want to give him some rest. Practice squad elevation. To return kicks. Jason Bean.
Ooh. And if you did that, they could work in some like razzle-dazzle plays.
Yes. Oh, yeah. No. Yeah. That's the obvious implication, is that you can have 2 quarterbacks on the field at the same time.
Okay. Then I will talk about them.
Can't be 3 though. Can't be 3 though, because the emergency quarterback is not allowed to go in unless there's injuries. So you can't put Ehlinger and Bean out there at the same time, unless you want to deactivate Flacco, which they're not going to do.
So they could put Jason Bean back at one of those spots and Joe Flacco at the other. I want to see Joe Flacco on the kick return team. I think that would be a lot of fun. I don't know if he wants that at this stage of his career, but
they didn't even make him play in the preseason. I don't think they're going to make Joe Flacco return a kick. If they do, the Colts are. You know what that is? That's the equivalent of like in Major League Baseball when a position player gets to pitch, or like if in a basketball game, college basketball is famous for this. When the guy that everybody knows has been on the roster for 4 years but never plays gets in, and everybody starts chanting for a 3. That's Joe Flacco on the kick return, and even then, they're not making him do it. They barely made him play in the preseason. But yes, there's my Jason Bean scenario for you.
The difference there is the walk-on basketball player, the position player that's having to pitch, are not going to get creamed by 11 guys running down the field at them. So it's a spot to put someone in.
Taysom Bean package.
Oh.
And yes, I said that wrong on purpose.
I like that.
If you don't know who Taysom is, that's on you. You have to go look it up.
It's a good nickname.
Jason Bean kickoff return practice squad elevation. Just saying. Just going to throw it out there.
Yeah, I mean that's all I got on the quarterbacks not named Richardson and Flacco.
Hear me out.
Take away from their stories, but this season's got to be about this. We need to watch Anthony Richardson.
Hear me out one more time. This involves Anthony Richardson. Okay. Josh Downs gets a breather. Okay. You've already elevated Jason Bean to from the practice squad for kick return duties. Bean goes into the slot. He runs that motion where you come all the way into the quarterback and kind of like loops behind him, like the crazy looking one that Downs did a bunch last year.
Mm-hmm.
And when Richardson takes the snap, he throws it backwards to Jason Bean as he's running out. And then it's like, it'd be like Philly special, except like wider across the field. Indy special.
Yeah, sure.
Anthony Richardson wheel route from 40 yards away.
You could do that. I also thought about like if you have a Jonathan Taylor injury, maybe you bring Joe Flacco in at quarterback just a couple times and put Anthony in the backfield. I mean, he can run 4.4 and he's like 244 pounds. I mean, his build's not too much different than Anthony's or than Jonathan Taylor. So maybe that's part of the plan. It's like you've got these players who can play so many different spots. They don't need to keep all these other. I haven't yet found out who the player is who's also going to play outside corner in addition to some other position, but they've got to have something up. Jason Bean outside.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I thought one interesting thing with Anthony is I asked Chris Ballard kind of what area he thought he's grown in now that he got to stack all these days in camp after coming off last year, not getting to play a lot. And he mentioned that like he feels like Anthony is two things. He feels like he does see advancements in terms of sliding, not taking hits that are sort of extracurricular, which I agree. I think his slide could use a little tune up to it, but it's a work in progress like everything else. And it's good that he's at least choosing to do a slide. But he also mentioned that like Anthony's taken a little bit more command of deciding like which plays he wants to run, which plays he thinks are good for certain situations, all the stuff that franchise quarterbacks eventually do. Very hard to do when you've just barely even played college football and now you're in the NFL. And I think back to like last year, Anthony felt like his first couple games, you saw obviously the build of him, some of the speed of him, but it very much felt like it's like I could hear him counting things out in his head, the steps and the drop back. And it was very progression, like, throw to this guy on this play type thing. And now it's just encouraging to hear that he's gaining enough of a feel for this by getting to be there every day, not just the mental reps they talked about that he got last year when he was out, but like going out there and trying things out all the time, that now he's having input on it. And like, I think there's been so many takes out there about how Anthony looks based on a preseason game. And we kept saying, you know what, they're running like 10% maybe of the offense they're going to run, because what they are doing though, it wasn't that they were just trying to run the clock out for 4 quarters and just get over the preseason. They're experimenting. And some of that was Anthony experimenting and deciding kind of what his role of input's going to be, kind of what he's most comfortable with is a way to build this out a little bit more, where last year they started out, it was a little robotic and it was safe and it was trying to just be mistake-free. This year, we're getting an indication that there's going to be an unleashing of him, at least in a stylistic, schematic way, that he has input on as well. So I think that's pretty fun to hear. And I'm sure that this is where it's so valuable for him to have a guy like Joe Flacco in that room to have these conversations with. And you just combine all these voices of Joe Flacco, Shane Steichen, even Sam Ehlinger, who's been, who's high-level backup or high-level thinker who's been in the league a little bit now, Cam Turner, Jim Bob Cooter, and like Anthony's catching up in those conversations and finding confidence and authoritative voice and translating that to the field. I think that's a fun development that I'm curious to see once we see the actual scheme and they actually try to do things that are going to tailor it to his game.
Okay, so those are our thoughts on the Colts roster. Well, we've been taping this. The Atlanta Falcons? Uh-oh. Yes, the Atlanta Falcons have traded Taylor Heineke to the Chargers. So trades are still happening. So here's what I'm going to offer.
Talk about the Falcons. Talk about a team that has more quarterbacks than they know what to do with.
Yep. Here's what I'm going to offer. What if someone needs a defensive tackle? someone with some experience, and they don't want to give up too much for him. They don't want it can't be costly, not from a draft pick or financial standpoint. They're just looking around and they're thinking, we don't have enough defensive tackles. We'd like another one. I have a tackle for them. His name is Taven Bryan.
And if any of those teams have an extra outside corner, and I don't even mean like a high-level one, a guy who knows how to play outside cornerback, can you drop back from the outside at cornerback? Is that in your toolbox? Then I think we have a great trade match here. Taven Bryan for an outside corner. We just did it.
There it is. So that will be another move that does not happen because nothing that Nate and I came up with happens. But keep your eyes peeled for Jason Bean, kickoff return specialist on a practice squad elevation, coming to your TV screens in Lucas Oil Stadium in November 2024. You're higher on the Joe Flacco part of this than I am. I'm just sticking to the Bean.
All right. Well, my theory is if you want to go crazy, go all the way crazy.
But wide receiver returner Bean, not quarterback Bean. If quarterback Bean gets on the field this year, something has gone horribly wrong, as you pointed out earlier.
Yeah.
That's it. That's it for us. When we talk next week, we will be previewing the Houston Texans, the opening opponent for the Indianapolis Colts. We're getting ready for real regular season football for the IndyStar. I am Joel Erickson. This is Nate Atkins. We're gonna get a little break here.